Well, we'd like to welcome those who've joined us so far. We are very excited to have a wonderful presentation this evening. I am Mike DeGeer. I'm going to go ahead and kick it off, even though it's just at 6:30. We'll have people who'll be joining because, like me, many people join a little bit late. I am the Vice Chair for Advocates for Public Education Policy. And for those of you who don't know our organization, we're a statewide coalition that works to educate the public and policymakers to ensure that public schools work for all. We were formed in response to concern about the adverse effects of the failed education reform policies. And because of these policies, we've been stuck with competition for students that's become the norm. We also have had neighborhood schools that have been closed, students' learning and well-being has suffered, and teachers have been devalued. As an organization, we believe very strongly that our students are being judged unfairly by test scores, that our public schools are subject to corporate moneyed interests that seek to privatize education, and that our education system is woefully underfunded. We support and sponsor legislation to address some of these priorities that we have, supporting educators' rights and professionalism, rethinking accountability, assessment, and teacher evaluation, ensuring that charter schools and innovation schools are equitable, accountable, and transparent. And as I said, that we have adequate and equitable funding, with public dollars not being used for private profit. We promote community schools, equal access, and wherever possible, desegregation, and an inclusive and comprehensive curriculum. We provide forums, summits, and webinars and other messaging to help inform the public about these critical issues today that are affecting our public education system. And we're very excited tonight to have someone speak to the topic of exposing the false narrative of public education's failure. Those of you who have joined us will be able to listen to Dr. Paul Thomas, who I'll introduce in a few minutes, and he'll be sharing some information with us related to this topic. As a little bit of background, for decades, media outlets and policymakers have promoted a false and misleading narrative that America's public schools are failing. And of course, they've only used a very narrow measure of what happens in terms of our schooling when they say this message about failing public schools. This storyline has been strategically advanced by far-right conservatives and neoliberal reformers who use emotionally charged rhetoric to shape the public opinion that happens as people read their news media. Since the pandemic, the attack has intensified through coordinated disinformation campaigns aimed at dismantling the image of public schools as safe, effective, and democratic spaces for learning. Our current education secretary, Linda McMahon, echoed this message when she claimed children should not be trapped in failing schools. Even today, Trump made a specific personal call to all the House of Representative members in Texas, urging them to vote for vouchers in order to stop the indoctrination centers that he says are taking place in our public schools. This false narrative has been used to justify high-stakes testing, privatization, and corporate-driven reforms, all while eroding public trust in our schools. This is the goal of Project 2025, to dismantle our public education system. But are schools really failing? And by what measures? Recent national surveys tell us that more than 75% of parents are very satisfied with their own child's education. So why is there such a sharp disconnect between the lived experience and the messaging we see in the media? Well, tonight, we're very lucky to have an expert with us this evening who's going to expose some of this information that we've been fed by our media. Dr. Paul Thomas is a professor of education at Furman University. He's been there for 23 years. He taught high school English in South Carolina before moving on to teacher education. He's a former column editor for English Journal, and he also writes for the current series for Critical Literacy Teaching Series. He's the author of How to End the Reading War and Serve the Literacy Needs of All Students, as well as Teaching Writing as Journey, Not Destination, essays exploring what teaching writing means. He was named the 2013 George Orwell Award winner, and he co-edited Critical Media Literacy and Fake News in Post-Truth America. He publishes a wonderful, insightful blog, a newsletter, Radical Scholarship, and I encourage you to check that out at the end of our session. Paul, before I introduce you, I just would like you to share with us briefly a few reasons why have chosen to discuss this topic, and then we'll jump into your slide presentation. And by the way, those of you who are here, we encourage you to put questions that you may have during the course of Paul's presentation in the Q&A section on the Zoom link, and then we'll try to address those questions at the end of his presentation, as many as we can get to. So as I said, Paul, before we start, tell us a little bit about why is this topic so important to you?
Interestingly, I started teaching, this is my 41st year. So I started teaching in 1984, which, as we'll see in a minute, is sort of ground zero for the current education reform movement. That was when A Nation at Risk came out. That literally is the first year that South Carolina initiated some high-level education reform. Literally 1984, the first fall that I started teaching, was a big reform year for my state. So I actually have had my entire career under the education reform movement. So I've seen it on the ground. I've seen what really happens in the classroom, and I've seen how this constant parade of new standards and new tests have not helped anybody except the people who run for office and the companies that sell the materials to address these standards and this testing. So I think it's just the lived reality of my career as an educator has accidentally coincided with exactly the era that I'm going to talk about.
That resonates with so many of us with A for PEP. Judy was a former teacher. I was a teacher, principal. So many of our people in our organization have been in education. And your message is going to be so important for the educators today and those policymakers who are making decisions about what happens for the educators. So we thank you for being here. And let's kick it off, Paul, and let's get it started.
Hopefully we can see that. Don't want to start too discouragingly here, but we're going to start with a French philosopher, Deleuze. Deleuze, I use this in my education classes. Has always been really profound for me, and this is from the 1980s, actually. The administrations in charge never cease announcing supposedly necessary reforms to reform schools, to reform industries, hospitals, the armed forces, and prisons. And reform has become, I call it an industry. It serves itself. And there's cycles of reform. So in the United States, we're in a constant state of educational crisis, which requires reform. And we allow that for maybe a decade. And then by the time the decade cycles through, then we're back at a crisis. And so we have to keep this constant cycle of crisis and reform, crisis and reform. And very few people interrogate that. And that's sort of what we'll do here today. As I mentioned a second ago, sort of ground zero of this is A Nation at Risk, which came out under Ronald Reagan. And we're seeing the fruition of the Reagan agenda, sadly. One of his main objectives, he actually had like three objectives when he formed the committee that came up with the report. One was to get rid of the Department of Education, which he called an abomination. And the other was to encourage America to embrace school choice. An interesting fact in the United States is, by and large, Americans do not like school choice. School choice advocates have tried a number of different strategies, and generally, even in Texas is having trouble passing this because Texans tend not to, like most of America, they like their public schools. They don't want to do school choice. And the other one was, Reagan said, to return prayer to school. And I always like to point out to people, if your president doesn't know the law, we've got a problem. Prayer has always been legal in public school. Anybody can pray in public school. What ended is that as an agent of the state, no teachers or administrators are supposed to coerce children into prayer. And you would think in America, stopping prayer coercion would be a good thing. But anytime you hear a politician say that, prayer is banned in school, I think you should take a step back because they're either lying or misinformed. So what Nation at Risk established, and I think this is the biggest problem, it established that all education reform was in school only. And this is a very American ideological position. I can show you, and I think it may be in here at some point, but decades of research, well over 60% of measurable student achievement is from out of school factors. So parental income, parental education, things like community wealth, access to all sorts of things in the community, and then schools in the United States tend to reflect the socioeconomic status of the community. And I always hate to say this is very painful to say, schools don't change society. Schools tend to reflect society. So when we label schools as good, I will bet you that that school is sitting in a very affluent neighborhood and the school has a low poverty index. When we say a school is bad, I will bet you that that school is sitting in a low socioeconomic, a high poverty area, and the school has high poverty. But education reform is committed in the United States to only reforming school. The other thing that Nation at Risk established, and then it was picked up by George W. Bush about 20 years later, almost exactly, was that when we bring up the influence of socioeconomic status, that's merely an excuse. So poverty as an excuse is a refrain. And I will say one thing that's really important. This is something that is believed regardless of political affiliation. Education reform is extremely conservative, but it is embraced by Democrats and Republicans very similarly. Again, this is very difficult to say, but the Obama administration's 8 years of education policy were worse than the W. Bush 8 years. That's hard to believe, but actually Obama picked up pretty much the George W. Bush agenda and intensified it. And the reason I would say it was worse is because Obama really accelerated charter schools. So Obama administration didn't change much of what Bush was doing, the W. Bush, and then added on this sort of embracing of a soft kind of school choice. The other thing that I think is really important to understand is a Nation at Risk established kind of a contradictory message about teachers. You'll hear people say the most important factor in student learning is the teacher. And then you'll also hear that teachers are failing. And one, that's not true. Again, these are painful statistics, but teacher influence on student measurable test scores is between 1 and 14%. I think everybody should sit with that for a second. There's some evidence that teachers change student measurable outcomes by only 1%. Out of school factors, well over 60%. Teacher factor is between 1 and 14%. You see the great inequity there. If we constantly say that we only reform the school, we have to have better teachers, we're moving the needle very slightly, probably not at all, which, of course, allows us to constantly say we're in crisis. If we don't do any reform that's going to be measurably impactful on the outcomes, then we can say, well, see, we're still failing. One thing that really concerns me is we constantly, and I would say it's mainly the media and political leaders. Schools are in crisis. Oh, wait a minute. Here's school X that's a miracle. We love pointing to schools that are outliers, and I'll tell you two things about that. One, almost 99 times out of 100, they aren't doing what they say they're doing. Two, even if a school is achieving disproportionate to what they should be, outliers don't mean anything in statistics. An outlier school is not replicable. You can't expand that into everybody. An outlier by nature is an outlier. It's very important. There's a lot of research on miracle schools, and honestly, they are very, very rare, and the media versions are almost never true. Also, A Nation at Risk started something that we're seeing right now. I'm going to talk a lot about reading and reading legislation in a minute. Um, the idea that there is one reform. There's one reform, there's one way to teach. All students need this sort of rhetoric is really, really dangerous because I believe, again, I've been teaching 41 years. I think the opposite is true. If you've got a room of 15 or 20 or 30 kids, you've got 15 or 20 or 30 different sets of needs, and it's a very hard job. One size does not fit all. I just wanted to point out this Edling is an international researcher, and this is not unique to the United States. This idea that education is in permanent crisis occurs all throughout the world. Right now, for us, I think it's really important to think about English-speaking countries. Virtually every English-speaking country in the world right now is having a reading crisis very similar to our reading crisis. And it's just a recurring reality of how we talk about literacy with young people. I've documented our first reading crisis very easily was around 1940. And then we've had one every single minute since then, which is kind of staggering. Also, some really smart people have pointed out the so-called reading crisis has never had outcomes that we've been warned about. So either they weren't real, or that students can't read has no consequences, which that second one seems kind of silly. That's not reality. What's actually true is we always say kids today can't and don't read, and it's almost never true. Um, you have access to this material, and this is just for your information. There's a lot of research on a nation at risk, and I strongly recommend the book by Berliner and Biddle called "The Manufactured Crisis." It might seem like it's getting old, but it's applicable to this minute right now. Yeah.
Paul, can I interrupt just a minute? Before we get into charter schools, I have a question around the reasons why this narrative of failure has continued to permeate our culture so much. And you're saying it started in the 1980s with Reagan. How come we're still dealing with it today? Can you speak to that, or you want to save that for later?
No, I think this is it's American mythology. It's American ideology. America's very much a bootstrap country. It's very much a rugged individualism country, and public education and all government services are communal. Americans by default have this sort of ideological distrust or disbelief in community. And we genuinely believe anybody can pull themselves out of poverty. We also genuinely believe the way to do it is by education. Both of those are not empirically true. There's a wonderful book and there's a concept called the undeserving poor. And I recommend that to everybody. That's actually the name of the book. But there's an idea in America that if you don't do well in school, if you don't do well in your career, it's your fault, because we have this mythology that everybody has the same opportunity.
Yeah.
And what I try to explain to people is that is aspirational. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute when I talk about NAEP testing. But there's nothing wrong with aspiring to a meritocracy. And I do think that's what we should be working toward. The reality is that we do not have a meritocracy. As a white male, straight white male, with a high IQ, I was just having this conversation with my partner. My mental ability just happens to match what we have decided counts as smart. If we change those metrics, that would be different. Of course, this is not accidental. The people who came up with the metrics for smart probably picked out things that they were good at. So that white men have had such power in the country, and it's hard for people to grasp, but I mean, white men have disproportionately had the power in the United States the entire history of the country. And so to me, a lot of this is purely ideological. It is
And
things we
we're dealing with that
believe
today. Yeah.
that does not match, but we have empirical data that disputes that. But we're not very fond of evidence in the United States.
All right. Go ahead with your information on charter schools.
So I think a really powerful and disturbing example of what I'm talking about tonight is what happened in New Orleans after Katrina. After Katrina, the Governor Jindal, he disbanded the entire public school system and he fired all the teachers. And gradually, over the next decade or so, New Orleans, the city of New Orleans, became entirely a charter school city. All the public schools were gone. They were replaced by charter schools. There was a huge influx of Teach for America teacher candidates. And a couple of things that are important to note about that is teachers constituted a huge percentage of Black professional people in the city, and many of those people left. There were huge amounts of middle and upper class people in New Orleans who left for places like Houston and into Texas and never returned. A a really disturbing fact here is after a decade, almost 2 decades of pure charter schools, student achievement was no better. Just recently, New Orleans has abandoned that experiment and is moving back to just traditional public schools, which the message here is the type of school, whether it's public, private, or charter, is not either the problem or the solution. There's very little difference in the outcomes of students based on the type of school. Student outcomes are still more strongly linked to socioeconomic status and the like community socioeconomic status, home socioeconomic status, and education level of the parents. What happened in New Orleans is an example of disaster capitalism, where either capitalism takes advantage of an existing disaster like Katrina, and then we've seen that with Helene in the South where I live, or you create a disaster, which may resonate with you now. This is sort of the Trump playbook. Trump is actually creating sort of a disaster capitalism himself. Create a disaster, and then there must be some sort of reform. In New Orleans, it took advantage of an actual disaster to insert a reform that people were not necessarily supporting. I do want to go back to a point I made a minute ago. This is hard maybe to hold in your mind at once, but education reform is extremely conservative and it is bipartisan. In the 40 years of reform since A Nation at Risk, almost all education policy at the state and federal level has been jointly supported strongly by Democrats and Republicans. I would say No Child Left Behind is an excellent example of that. The Democratic Party eagerly worked with George W. Bush to pass legislation, and you will rarely see Democrats or Republicans say anything positive about public education. In the 90s here in South Carolina, I remember very vividly Democrat and Republican governors both had billboards saying that public education in South Carolina we were 50th in the nation. Both candidates were saying the exact same thing, which was false or horribly misleading to run for office. Some examples of conservative education policy is Teach for America, which has really petered out. It had a very high point back during the Bush and then the Obama administration, but also a really powerful organization, National Council on Teacher Quality, NCTQ, for over 20 years now. They've been putting out reports that teacher education is terrible and that is failing our schools. And it is a wing of the Fordham Foundation, which is a school choice conservative school choice organization out of Ohio. They never had any intention to reform teacher education. Their job is to make you believe that teacher education is failing. Now, what is the goal of conservative education reform? The key word here is, I talked a minute ago about permanent crisis, but the key here is churn. And if I'll go back for a second and talk a little bit about school choice, I've done a lot of work on school choice, but one thing we know about school choice, and Florida is a good example of this, is when parents are given school choice, they tend to abandon that choice and return to their home schools. Florida had aggressive school choice in the early 2000s. And if a school received a failing report card a few times, then parents were allowed school choice. Only about 3% of parents took the choice. And within a couple of years, virtually every one of them had returned to their home school. Well, why is churn a good thing? Think about cars. Does the car industry want us to buy one car and keep that car for 20 years? Or does the car industry want us to constantly trade in and buy new cars? Well, that's churn. The iPhone, our cell phones, another great example. You know, every year or two, a new phone comes out that is marginally different, but it's important. We need to trade in the old phone and we need to get a new phone. Churn is a feature of capitalism. It generates capital. It generates wealth for somebody. But it's not good for education. We actually know that stability in education is actually a better aspect. Another thing that I think we should keep in mind is George W. Bush, as an education governor and then an education president, came out of Texas with the Texas Miracle that was debunked. That actually he did not improve education in Texas. But it's really important. In the 90s, George W. Bush was advocating scripted curriculum. And this is something you're going to hear me talk about a couple of times tonight. It did not stick. People were not a fan of scripted curriculum. But scripted curriculum is literally the teacher is told exactly what to say, and there's a script, and the students are supposed to say exactly what's written in the script. That's deprofessionalizing teachers. Also, it's the worst kind of one-size-fits-all. But the roots of scripted curriculum is under George Bush in the 90s in Texas. Currently, scripted curriculum has come back very strongly and with almost no resistance, which is really discouraging.
Can you comment on one of the biggest problems with scripted curriculum? Because it is a real concern that I hear from my teacher friends all the time throughout the state. Why is it such a problem, besides the fact that it's related to the churn issue and the money making?
Yeah, I'd say scripted curriculum has two huge ideological problems. It deprofessionalized the teacher. This is not funny, but a joke that I've been making is I think our goal is to have schools be like self-checkout. So we eventually want like one non-professional monitoring students sitting at a bank of computers that's scripted and AI. And we're moving in that direction. Well, education obviously will not be better, but that is way cheaper right? Anybody can stand, I don't mean this mean, I'm sorry for people that work at grocery stores, but generally the person that stands up there and watches everybody do self-checkout is an entry-level job. and and they're not very professional. They're literally just monitoring. The other thing that is a problem is that scripted curriculum assumes, again, what I mentioned a minute ago, that one size fits all. There's no way to tailor what students actually already know and what students actually need with a scripted program they have to work through. And we know that students don't like participating in scripted curriculum. We also know that teachers do not like using scripted curriculum. Also, the problem with scripted curriculum is it feeds into how we monitor teachers and how we assess teachers. And a word you will hear that's very, very problematic is fidelity. And we've been obsessed with this for quite a while. Most of the time, when you hear teachers being evaluated, it's about are they sticking to the program, as opposed to are they meeting the needs of their students? Those are two drastically different questions. I don't think any of us who are teachers have a problem with being held accountable for addressing the needs of our students. But I honestly, I have no interest in being held accountable for fidelity to a program. I would say our fidelity should be to the students. That would be my
Thank you.
my counter. So one of the recent faces on education reform is a journalist, Emily Hanford. She has accumulated a great deal of power, and I do think it's important. Don't discount the role of the media in our education reform as industry. And about 2018, Emily Hanford published an article in APM, American Public Media, which is a defunct publication now. They have shifted to being entirely like a podcast. But it was called Hard Words, and she declared students unable to read in the United States. She also declared that teachers don't know how to teach reading, and she also declared that teacher educators are the reason teachers don't know how to teach reading. For this slide, I want to point out a couple of things. Notice that she is highlighted in Education Next. That is a very conservative publication. Notice that she is retweeted by Moms for Liberty. Moms for Liberty is a huge fan of the of the reading crisis rhetoric, and she also, on the right here, received an award from George W. Bush. Also very popular with Jeb Bush. Jeb Bush has an organization in Florida called Excel in Ed, EXCELIN Ed. And they have template legislation on their webpage. They actually have a template for reading reform legislation that states are pulling off their website and just putting in the specifics about their states. So the media really feeds the education reform movement because they love stories of crisis. They love stories of miracles. And the bad news is most of their stories are not accurate. They're very misleading. Recently, an organization has popped up called the Evidence Advocacy Center, which sounds really, really impressive. And they're directly saying, and this goes back to the question Mike asked about scripted curriculum. They're saying that this is necessary, but educators will relinquish certain freedoms. There's a very, very, very strong push in the United States for scripted curriculum. One who benefits from this, well, the education publishers who are creating these. So you have states like Arkansas that are actually banning some reading programs, and you have places like New York City that are mandating specific reading programs. Again, this goes back to the concept of churn. I will argue till my last breath. Reading programs and education programs have neither succeeded or failed students. They're relatively irrelevant. Any program would work. The key again is the teacher put in the position to use whatever materials are in front of them to meet the needs of their students. And too often, especially with reading, and it's very common in math too, we're more concerned about whether or not the teacher is teaching the program instead of the students. But it was really important. We've been beating the drum for decades. America has to believe that teachers are failing, that schools are failing, and that teacher educators are incompetent. And these are consistent messages, messages that we get in the United States. Um, this current reading reform movement, it's really important to understand it's media, it's political leaders, but it's also parent organizations. Dyslexia, parents of children with dyslexia, there's a group called Decoding Dyslexia. That organization exists in all 50 states, and they actually push for specific legislation. They lobby state legislators to get reading legislation. And you can see here, I've always thought this was very telling. The International Dyslexia Association still has this up on a web page. It's from 2014. Structured literacy will help us sell what we do well. I think that use of the terminology is extremely important here and very disturbing. The two things to me that are a problem with education reform, it's often politics and it's often marketing. And neither one of those serve the needs of public education teachers or students. Going back to Emily Hanford, I think this is a real telling point. This is on the Education Writers Association website. I think she knew this would be a problem. There was a lot of promises made in 2018, 2019, into 2020 about switching to more phonics-based reading instruction. And she warned if scores don't go up, then we have to just, hold tight. And she declared that journalists had to be watchdogs over teachers. And I've always found that very disturbing language. And it's very demeaning to teachers. And part of that is because there is a bad teacher myth in the United States. I always like to point out over 80% of elementary teachers are women. Over 70% of all public school teachers in the United States are women. And I think we have to really, really, really interrogate why we're comfortable with demonizing the entire profession that is almost entirely made up of women. And I do think sexism plays a part in this. And I think people just really don't understand the professionalism and the difficulty of being a classroom teacher. Here are some things that I've pointed out already, but I just like to emphasize. So one of the big examples that I'm going to use for the rest of this is about the science of reading movement and that students can't read and this sort of recurring reading crisis. And again, the media and political leaders have said that there's one established way of teaching reading, and it's systematic phonics for all students. One, that claim isn't true, but two, it resonates. America has always kind of believed that. If some of you remember, Hooked on Phonics was a very popular product that actually got taken to court and lost. Excuse me, but Americans tend to believe that reading is taught by teaching, direct phonics. And there always has to be a bad person and a bad idea. In America right now, that's balanced literacy. In the 1990s, it was whole language. In the 1950s and 1960s, it was John Dewey and progressivism. Some of the specifics are different, but the cycles of attacks on public school and public education are very similar. There's a very conservative ideological attack, and the framing is that teachers, schools, and practices are either liberal or progressive or soft or not scientific. But this is recurring. We've had the exact same sort of rhetoric around reading and public schools in general. 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, every single decade. This is the same exact story. So I think it's important to know some of the specific details. So who benefits? And you'll see here on the left, and this is happening a great deal even at our professional organizations. They're sponsored by these organizations. They're sponsored by, the education marketplace. And the influence of money and the influence of political influence and the influence of ideological influence, these are huge in education. And I think that's a lot of what's driving sort of still I call education reform as industry. I mentioned national NCTQ a moment ago. Again, it's an offshoot of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, which is an extremely conservative think tank. Dibbles is a way to test children for phonics knowledge. It actually has students pronounce nonsense words, which is pronounce words that don't actually exist. So it's completely making them use phonics rules and not produce any meaning at all. As you'll see, Dibbles is trademarked. It is a program. Same thing with Letters, LETRS. That is a program to train teachers by Louisa Moats. If you go to her page, you see the publisher. All of this is very market oriented. To get new training for teachers, you have to convince people that teachers aren't well trained. To get new reading programs for students, you have to convince people students can't read. There's huge organizations. The Reading League is one. The 95% group is another. The 95% group is really, really fascinating. They claim that 95% of children can be on grade level as readers. I'm not even sure what they exactly mean by that, but it's based in zero research. That is not a research-based position. It's completely an ideological position. Now, I would say at the heart of this, and this goes back to Reagan, this goes back to the 80s and 90s. The United States uses a test called NAEP, National Assessment of Educational Progress, and it's done by the Education Department. Trump may have just killed NAEP. Some people are concerned that we may not continue implementing NAEP, but that'll be something to look at. But every 2 years approximately, we do math and reading, and it's a random sampling of students. Not every student takes it, but there's a random sampling of students in every state. So it provides the kind of data that is very dangerous. We start ranking states by their NAEP scores. We tend not to pay attention to things like poverty level of the states. But here you'll see an interesting fact. The top scoring schools in the United States are the Department of Defense schools. And they have very, very high scores. They've had very high scores for a long time. Keep in mind, Department of Defense students, they have health care. Their parents have stable jobs. Many of the things that we talk about that are out of school factors that negatively hurt students are not there. They're still very diverse. People that come into the military are not necessarily coming out of affluence. But the negative effects of out of school factors are mitigated because they are in the military. And you'll notice here in grade 4 lately, Mississippi and Florida have been way up. This is the top 25% in NAEP scores in grade 4. Hard to believe from Mississippi, I think, because it's such a high poverty state. Florida has done this for quite a while. Now, what's worth noting is in grade 8, the Department of Defense schools remain the top. Mississippi and Florida are suddenly in the bottom. They're in the bottom 25%. What that means is that those grade 4 scores are inflated. They're not accurate. And all of these states that we talk about being miracle schools, this goes back to the miracle concept, they haven't closed any of the achievement gaps, the racial or socioeconomic achievement gaps. And here's the trick. All the states that are seeing higher grade 4 NAEP scores have very high levels of grade retention. One of the most popular and dangerous education reform uh, education reform strategies is grade retention, and they're doing it in third grade. So if you retain kids in third grade, you're going to be pulling out the lowest performing students when they're in grade 4, and then reintroducing them when they're 1 year older. And as you see here, Mississippi's been doing this for a decade, and their numbers haven't really decreased that much. They still are retaining about 9 or 10,000 students a year. Um, I would call these manufactured miracles, and this is what I was mentioning a minute ago. There's a good study from Westall and Cummings that says that no states are raising test scores without grade retention. So it's not the programs, it's not teacher quality, it's none of the things they're claiming about how we teach reading. The key element for raising test scores in grade 4 is retaining students. And this is the information that I mentioned a minute ago. There's a fairly recent study that says that 63% of test scores are connected to out-of-school factors. This is a little hard to see, but it's really important. I'll try to pull it up a little bit here for you. What do we mean when we're talking about kid reading proficiency? The big problem in the United States is we don't have a standard metric. All of these states are calling their state test proficient, but if you look here, this is NAEP basic. So it's really misleading. The media tends to talk about NAEP proficient and will exaggerate or misrepresent student achievement on reading. The honest truth here is that we don't know the level of reading ability in the United States because we don't have a standard metric. And I think NAEP is designed, in my opinion, to feed a constant crisis. And I did want to mention, we don't have as much information on this because it's recent, but everything I've talked about is being replicated under the Trump administration. Education reform is being used to promote Project 2025. The critical race theory, the DEI attacks, these are not about anything to do with education. They're purely ideological. We're having the highest levels of censorship and curriculum bans ever in the United States. This is not about improving education. This is about pushing a conservative agenda. Eliminating Department of Education, I think people miss sometimes. That eliminates Title I, Title IX, and also the Office of Civil Rights is under the Department of Education. I will say, even though I sounded pretty harsh about Obama earlier, the best thing about the Obama administration is it really ramped up the Office of Civil Rights. There were some really good things done under the Office of Civil Rights under the Obama administration. And you'll see, I thought it was kind of dead, but school choice and vouchers are making a huge comeback. School choice and vouchers are not about making schools better. It's about giving money to affluent parents, regretfully. Again, I really think at the heart of this is testing. It helps create this image of failing schools. And until we set aside, this is what Marin and Tinkin say, we've got to set aside this obsession with standardized testing because it does not tell you if students learn. It basically tells you about their socioeconomic status. How are we doing, Mike? Did you want to?
We're doing good. I wanted to ask you to go back just a minute to.
Sure.
Yeah. No, that's fine. You can stay there. Basically, we've had all the testing. We continue to have testing. What's the impact that's having on kids in terms of as they come up through the grades and into college? How is this affecting their lives and their learning abilities and their growth and their learning? This pressure to achieve on these tests, as well as the way we're narrowing our curriculum and the scripted curriculum you referred to. What is happening in terms of the student learning output that we're getting, that you see? And then we'll talk about this.
Sure. I think, again, I've done this for 41 years. I went to high school in the 1970s. When I was in my high school, I had the option of taking 0 AP courses, 0. Um, I taught in that same high school in the 80s and 90s. We had the highest percentage of students in the 80s and 90s taking AP courses in the entire state. Um, I know this isn't popular. Kids in schools are better today than they've ever been. That shows you a lot of resilience because I think we do horrible things to children in our schools. Um, my students at Furman, I've been there 23 years. They're as smart or smarter than they've ever been. Now, I will add a caveat. I think since COVID, our young people are more traumatized than ever. They are frail. I feel more frail. The world, I think, is more tenuous. I think we are more anxious. And I notice my students are definitely more anxious. Are they capable? Yes. They're actually eager to learn. And so I think that young people are incredibly resilient. I'm kind of shocked at how well our students do. I just do not see any evidence that kids today are worse than some kind of idealized kids in the past. I actually think kids get better and better.
Yeah.
Their opportunities are better. They have more access to knowledge. They have more access. A lot of my students really benefit from their hobbies. Um, they play video games. They watch a lot of series, and they're very serious about it. They're not wasting their time on television. They like watching, pretty complex series, and they know a lot of information. It may not be the way that some of us knew information.
And kids today are learning a lot more than what is measured by those narrow tests. They're learning social, personal development, character development. They're developing artistic music skills, and we don't measure that. And that's the media game that we're dealing with, and the conservative message. We've got a question in the chat. We know conservatives are pushing this. Why are the Democrats getting sucked into it? That was one of the questions that we got, and then we'll.
Well, the Democratic Party is very conservative. We do not have a left. We do not have a left political party. People in other countries kind of laugh when they hear, Republicans call Democrats communist and socialist. And Barack Obama was very, very moderate. Again, his education agenda was conservative. There was nothing progressive about his education policy. We just do not have a left in the United States.
Yeah.
And I would say Democrats have some progressive tendencies. And I would say historically, Democrats do support public education. I just don't think they're very good at following through on what that looks like. Just about everybody in America buys into the bootstrap and the rugged individualism, and don't really recognize systemic influence on things. And I think that's just the problem with both of our political parties.
And the impact of poverty. Did you want to speak to this in your last few slides, and then we'll open it up to other questions?
Well, yeah, I was just going to say I thought it would be. I hate to sound so negative, but I do think there are some things we could do better, and I think if we quit focusing reform on saying that this program failed, but this program will save our students, so we need to decouple reform from programs. And there's a market reason from that. Also, I'd say we really dramatically need to change our national and state testing. I've been begging for this. I really wish we had a national standard metric for age level reading. I don't think it should be grade level. It should be age level. So we should have a national standard. 9-year-old reading, 10-year-old reading. I don't necessarily believe that's a real thing, but I'm saying if we had that metric, the state test and the national test would be measuring the same thing. And then the media would be talking about the same thing. Right now, when we say proficient or grade level, it's all over the place. People don't know what they're talking about, and it's really misleading. I'm hugely against grade retention. It's very harmful. We should get rid of grade retention. It's just punishment. Americans love to punish other people's children. Um, I also think that we should do a much better job monitoring our students who aren't succeeding the way we want them to. We do not ensure Black, brown, poor, special need, multilingual learner students. We do not guarantee them small class sizes. We do not guarantee them experienced teachers. And we know the evidence. Those vulnerable populations tend to be in the largest classes with the least experienced teachers. That's a policy we actually could enact. We could guarantee that students that are below whatever metric we determine, that they're guaranteed to have an experienced teacher and to be in a low class size classroom. Um, and I do think, to me, the best thing we could do for raising test scores would be universal health care, and maybe good paying jobs and secure and stable jobs. But inside schools, we should be doing a lot about with like teaching and learning conditions. Again, class size matters, and people try to argue against that, but it's very, very important. And again, I think we are misserving special needs and multilingual learners. That is not false, and that is a messaging you hear, but we're not really doing anything to help them.
Well, again, funding is a big issue. In Colorado, I think it's $4 billion we're short in the last many years. We haven't been funding our schools. Derek Black, who's going to be with us next month, talks about the fact that if we'd only increase our funding by a certain percent and really put money where we need to put it, we could have a change in the outcomes for so many students. But
Right.
we've held back. Colorado is one of the lowest funding states in the nation, even though we have some high achievement for some students. Yeah.
Well, most states have pockets. They have pockets of affluence, pockets of poverty, and
Right.
that's what we don't address.
Yeah. I think we've got a few more questions that we're going to go to. Is this the last slide, Paul?
Yeah.
We've got a question here about the English language students. The question was, what do you see for those students moving forward, given maybe the changes with the lack of, if we might have no Department of Education, for example, and what about our Title I schools as it relates to the funding that we've been getting? What do you see in the future in that regard as it relates to their needs, and how can they be addressed?
Well, I will say I'm very, very impressed. The multilingual learner community, the scholars, the teachers, the parents have been some of the best advocates during this recent reading crisis movement. They're strong advocates for meeting the individual needs of students. The MLL community helped stop reading legislation in California. And so if you want to listen to people that are probably right about this stuff, listen to the MLL scholars. It's some of the best people in this country. And what I do like about what they're saying is it's individual needs. We often misunderstand students who are acquiring English as their second language. Some of them come out of backgrounds where their home language, they're not very proficient in it. And we expect them suddenly to be proficient in a second language. There are a lot of expectations that are just unrealistic.
Yeah.
I worry about these groups because I think dismantling the Department of Education, that's who's going to be hit the hardest.
Yeah.
They're just going to go back being invisible.
Yeah, I agree. How about the teachers, though? They're being pressured more and more, and the retention of teachers continues to be a concern. People are quitting the profession after 2 or 3 years, so we don't have our solid experienced teachers. How do we address the issue of retention of teachers? That was a question from this chat.
We've got to change our attitude. If every time you open your computer and you see an article about teachers or failures, teachers don't know. I still can't believe that we allow journalists to say that reading teachers don't know what they're doing. Like it's just, It's an entire profession. These are people that have taught for 20 and 30 years and given their lives to children. I know these people. They're wonderful people. They're professionals. They know what they're doing. We've got to change the rhetoric. We've got to change the conditions of being a teacher. I did K-12 education for 18 years, and when I left, I had a cast on my hand from marking papers. It's physically exhausting. It's psychologically exhausting, and we pretend that's not an issue. So we've got to do it. I mean, teachers don't necessarily want more pay. They want respect, and they want authority. They want their own autonomy. And right now, we're taking both of those away.
Yeah. Go ahead and take off the slides, and then we'll just have we have a few more questions coming from the group. Paul, let me read this one for you. Again, let's see here. These are social. All right. The point you're making, as I understand, is that whatever curricular issues there are in schools, they're linked more closely to class and income. Those are large social questions, hard to address individually. Is there something practical that an individual parent could look for in their kid's curriculum that should be there but isn't? Or is there that something that shouldn't be? In Colorado, not only do different districts have different curricula, different schools do too. And by the way, this person's a Furman graduate and wanted to say hi, and he owes you a lot, by the way. Oh, he's from 2009 to 2010, a student of Jim Edwards.
Oh yeah, yeah. Jim Edwards and I went to the same high school. We were both graduated from Woodruff High School, a little redneck high school in South Carolina. We both ended up being professors at Furman University. It's kind of a weird dynamic. He was a wonderful guy.
Go ahead.
I don't. This is also. I have my doctorate is in curriculum and instruction, and to be blunt, I don't think curriculum matters. They just need something. I mean, I still think we overemphasize on our students have the right curriculum. I don't think that matters. I do think what it matters is, are they doing authentic things? Are they getting to make their own decisions? Do they have choice? Are they fully engaged in the academic behavior? These are way more important. My writing courses, the content doesn't matter. They choose their own topics. They choose a lot about the kinds of papers that they write. But for me, it's to have them have an authentic experience as a writer where they're making decisions, they're taking risk. So I think we really overemphasize curriculum and content.
So in Colorado, I watched a presentation at the State Board of Education on the science of reading and how it has become sort of imbued in our systems. The question that's coming from the chat is, do you have suggestions on how to combat the Colorado Department of Education advocating for science of reading programs? I mean, this is really being pushed hard, not just by the CDE, but also by the state board, who have been sold this message that this is the only way we're going to get our test scores up. I think what it says is, what can we do? And is it too late now as districts are using state money and they can only buy certain reading programs? Yep. How can that be changed?
Reach out to me. This is what I do. I provide resources for people to fight this all over the country. Luckily, we have a lot of really good people out there who have written open access materials walking you through that balanced literacy didn't fail. Scripted curriculum and structured literacy does not succeed. Letters has no science behind it. I just did a 4-part series for English Journal walking through every bit of this. I do think parents can have an impact. Parents need to be informed. Parents need to speak up. School districts tend to listen to parents before they listen. They're not going to listen to me. I mean, I'm just a college professor, but they do listen to parents. But I think parents need to be better informed. And a huge part of my job, and I think in my life right now, is I provide this material for free. I have all the information on the claims made by the science of reading advocates, and I can help people discredit those claims.
We have an earlier question about Louisiana. She thought that the test scores had gone up in Louisiana during COVID, and no other state. Is she remembering that correctly?
That just happened, yeah. That's the new miracle. So in 2019, it was Mississippi. Now it's Louisiana. Louisiana retains 20,000 kids a year.
Okay.
So it's the same playbook. Florida started this in the early 2000s. This is actually called the Florida model. Florida still retains about 17,000 third graders a year. If you retain a ton of students in the third grade, your fourth grade scores go up. Most of these states do not have the same outcomes in the eighth grade, so I call it a mirage. Those fourth grade scores are not accurate because they don't continue them into eighth grade.
You know, we've talked about this, but I want you to repeat your point. Who is gaining from this false narrative that we've got around education, and why is this becoming so widespread with the push for charters, the push for vouchers, for alternatives? What's really going on politically, or can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I do. The only people that profit are politicians. Every politician says schools are failing, I will fix them. So there's political capital in that. The education marketplace benefits a huge amount. The education marketplace wants churn. The media benefits from this because it's clickbait. These stories like Emily Hanford, Dana Goldstein, Natalie Wexler, they've written dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of articles that say the exact same false story. They just read, and people love to click on a story that says kids can't read. It just happened with Nate with math. We're seeing the exact same thing happen with math. Kids can't do math. Math teachers don't know what they're doing. Math education is junk. That is the exact same narrative.
Well, and as someone pointed out in the chat, conservatives and Republicans frequently point their fingers at teachers' unions as the villains at the root of failing schools. They never say exactly how that happens, but they claim that getting rid of teachers' unions would result in better schools and presumably higher test scores. Again, another false narrative.
Right, because the lowest scoring states in the United States are in the South, and we're all right to work states. I've never been in a union. I've never had access to a union. They're illegal in South Carolina. All the top scoring states like Massachusetts are unionized states. It's actually the opposite. There's a strong correlation between unionized states and higher test scores. That's misleading because it tends to be more about poverty and affluence, but there is no evidence that teachers unions have created some kind of, educational crisis.
Yeah, we will have this recording available on A4PEP's website. We're also going to have Paul's slides available. That was a question from the group. I want to just kind of pause now. Given we covered most of the questions, and in interest of time, I want to thank you, Paul. This was very, very informative and very relevant, especially given the current climate we are in right now with respect to the efforts to destroy and demean our public education system at the top of the nation, as well as throughout so many states, and this push for vouchers, as well as the corporate reform world we're living in through charterization. But thank you again. We really appreciate it. We're going to be able to talk about upcoming webinars. Or did you want to speak to that, Rob? Or do you want me to do that?
Mike, why don't you take the first one here? You know Derek personally.
For those of you who are following some of our work, we're trying to inform the public this year, especially about what's going on in education, both nationally as well as here in Colorado. Derek Black is an expert in the history of education, and he wrote a book several years ago. I'll just hold it up here. I don't know if I had a way to show it, but this is Schoolhouse Burning. His most recent book is called Dangerous Learning, the South's Long War and Black Literacy. As we deal with this absurd executive order to stop DEI across school districts and states in the nation, as well as universities, he has the historical information on that, and he's going to be with us on May 21st. He's an expert in this regard, and I look forward to hearing from him. I hope you all will join us. And then in June, go ahead and tell us about we're so lucky to have this person come. Rob, you're on.
Yeah, I was really, really happy that Catherine Stewart did respond to the request that we made, and she is going to be coming to speak with us in June. We're still working out some of the details. She's going to be traveling in June, so we've got to work around her schedule a little bit, but she will be joining us sometime in the third, fourth week, probably third, fourth weekend of June, specifically to talk about her new book, Money, Lies, and God. I recommend during one of our last webinars, I'd recommend that everybody pick up her book, The Power Worshippers, kind of as a primer to what's we are all experiencing now with the rise of Christian nationalism. She has a new book out now that goes more into depth about those things. And I am really, really excited. I know Mike's really excited too, that she agreed to come and speak with us. And that's going to be in June. So keep that one in the back of your mind. And registration for both of those webinars will be opening at some point over the next few days. And we'll let everyone know via our email distribution list when that's ready for you.
Thanks, Rob. And we will have, as I said, all the information that you heard today from Paul on our website, along with a link to his wonderful newsletter. I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and please do what you can to stay courageous and hopeful in these times. We will definitely get that to you. Thank you again, and may everybody have a great evening. I want to thank Paul for your wonderful contribution. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you all.